All right, well, we talked quite a bit now about the saint. We also talked about the judge or critic, and we talked prior to that about the explorer. I do want to note now that the shepherd is also similar to what's called the sovereign or the king or the queen even. The one-eyed king is a metaphor I want to bring up real quick here. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. That's the one-eyed king. I'm presenting all of this information in part just to present it and start conversations with people. I'm also presenting it to invite people who understand these matters and are interested in them to check out the website One-Eyed Kings Wealth Club.com. One-Eyed Kings Wealth Club.com. Now I'm going to say a little bit about the shepherd. As I mentioned in the very first video, the shepherd is a traditional religious metaphor in Christian archetypes and symbolism. The shepherd begins with the symbol of a flock of sheep led by a herder. Sheep herder is where the word shepherd comes from. Sheep herd, sheep herder, shepherd. So there's a flock of sheep led by a herder who tends over the flock as their owner or their master or bishop. The word bishop is derived from the roots to watch over, same as the word episcopal. Episcope and bishop actually have the exact same roots etymologically. The shepherd is also a classic Christian metaphor for a religious leader or even for a church institution itself, such as the Good Shepherd Church, or our denomination is, or maybe the Council of Bishops is the shepherd over the flocks of the congregants of our denomination. That kind of metaphor and poetry is often found in religious institutions. So within this metaphor of the shepherd and the sheep of a flock of sheep, there also are dangers to the sheep, such as wolves. It could be Satan, it could be the devil, it could be the weather, or it could be sharp-teethed wolves. And we notice wolves are symbolic of danger in many cases. Little Red Riding Hood story, lots of stories use wolves because they are relatively common through a large part of the earth, and the cultures of the earth are familiar with wolves, and wolves are quite dangerous, especially to sheep. The shepherd partners with the flock, protecting the flock from the wolves, identifying dangers and protecting the flock from those dangers. The shepherd promotes their own interest as well as the interests of the flock, because the shepherd benefits from the flock, so the shepherd promotes the interests of the flock out of the interests of the shepherd. So what is it that the shepherd gets from the flock? Well, the shepherd fleeces or gets the wool of the sheep. The shepherd may also kill the sheep and then have its skin or have its meat, the lamb chops, those kinds of benefits. So the shepherd raises sheep, gets their wool season after season or year after year, and then also breeds them and eventually may kill them and eat them, or sell them, alive, or sell them dead, whatever. But that's the whole metaphor of the shepherd over that flock. So the flock gets something. What do they get from the shepherd? They get protection. They get that person looking out for danger, looking out for wolves and protecting them from wolves. Now, a shepherd may also train some sheepdogs to assist in the herding of the flock. The German Shepherd dog is a breed that specifically references shepherd. It's a shepherd dog or a sheep herding dog. And there are many other dogs that have been used to herd sheep, many other breed of dogs, but that's a well-known one. In human social orders, archetypical shepherds are those who influence, govern, and guide the attention, perception, and behavior of other humans, of a society of people, a group, or an individual, or a church congregation. Those would be, metaphorically, the sheep. It could also be, in political metaphor, the constituents of a particular political jurisdiction. A shepherd watches over those sheep. The sheriff, or the governor, or the Supreme Court judge, those would all be official functions similar to that of a bishop or a priest. In certain cultures at certain times, the priests and bishops had tremendous authority, such as during the Inquisition of the Holy Roman Empire. If we go back several thousand years, the tribal elders were priests, medicine men or medicine women, priestesses, and warlords. So there was an overlap as far as who functioned to govern and guide the group. Shepherds do not primarily explore the world or judge the world, at least not reactively, in a critical or condescending way. Or if they ever do that, it's not reactively, it's intentionally, and as a test and as a tool. And nor do they have an impulse, reflexive, desperate urge to save the world. Shepherds rule the world or govern the world. They set rules for the world, or they set measures and standards, and then they enforce them. They rule the world. They govern the world. They influence the behavior of the flock, of the group of people. Shepherds intentionally name or label specific things as right and specific other things as wrong. And they do so from a particular context, a historical context, and from what they deem relevant, and from what their interests are. Then, after they identify what's right and wrong, then they may train judges or critics to promote those systems of labeling and impose them throughout a society or a social order. They're the laws and the procedural rules, and those are set up by shepherds, and then they hire judges, they hire and train judges and police officers and militaries to go out and enforce those systems of organized coercion. But what's going to be promoted and what's going to be punished, what's going to be rewarded, those things are identified by the shepherds, and then they set up the systems to promote the reward and punishment procedures that they create and think up. So, shepherds may use propaganda or any other means to direct the well-being of their flock, to keep their flock loyal, to exclude or punish or the disloyal, and to demonize not only wolves, but any perceived threat to the flock. And they may even make up mythological threats to the flock simply to bring coherence to the flock, or bring loyalty or cohesion to the flock, or to the congregation, or to the constituents of a political jurisdiction. They want to crystallize support for a particular war, a particular political program, a particular campaign. How do they do that? By any means necessary. Any perceived threat to the flock is a way of keeping the flock together and keeping it loyal. And the first order of a shepherd is to identify real threats. Are there other shepherds trying to take these sheep from that shepherd? That's a real threat from the shepherd's perspective. Certainly other flocks or wolves who would kill the sheep, that's a real threat. And then you have the various symbolic or fictitious or fantastic fantasy threats that can be constructed through propaganda. All of those are possible constructions. Shepherds are really clear about language and what it is and what it's for. Language is for the direction and influencing of attention, perception, and behavior. Further, shepherds may demonize the methods of shepherds, of all shepherds, such as to monopolize on those behaviors most relevant to their interests. So shepherds universally may condemn propaganda and universally utilize it. Shepherds may universally say, our system of government is the best, or our church is the only true one. And when I say universally, I mean they have a tendency to do that. It's actually not universal. But at a certain stage, in terms of the building of a group or society, there would be a pretty fanatical fundamentalism promoted by shepherds, or that there's a tendency for that to develop. So shepherds say coercion is bad, violence is bad, propaganda is bad. That's typical, not absolute universal, but it's typical for them to condemn propaganda, yet also universally apply it with intricate competence. They're clearly expert propagandists, and yet they will say propaganda is immoral and should be punished, and no one should ever do it, and we'll set up a organization called the FCC or whatever organization to make sure that commercial influences aren't interfering with, public interest, as if private commercial interests are fundamentally and intrinsically in conflict with the public interest. Well, the public interest means the interest of a specific group. Commercial interests mean the interests of a specific group. They're just different groups. So, as I mentioned already in regard to language, shepherds recognize language as simply one tool for influence, among many other tools for influence and governing. Shepherds establish taboos and what is forbidden, what is evil, what is disgusting, despicable. Shepherds may form diagnostic systems for labeling various ideas or patterns of communication and patterns of language as crazy. And then they would lock up certain people who display those patterns, which might be considered threats to the social order. And then they also form diagnostic systems for labeling various patterns as criminal, to perhaps execute people who conduct those patterns. And I've mentioned it elsewhere, and I'll mention it again real quick here. Racketeering and extortion are patterns of human behavior. Shepherds come in and say, some shepherds say, we're going to monopolize those patterns. How? By licensing them, and anyone who's not licensed to perform extortion and racketeering, also known as taxation under the licensure, anyone not licensed and not operating according to our specific policies and codes, that's unlicensed or criminal racketeering or extortion. And we're going to look out to identify people who are doing that, who are prospective competitors to our system of organized coercion and racketeering and extortion, and we're going to identify them, monitor them, and punish them, unless it suits our purposes and our interests. In national interests, we'll give them a presidential pardon, or never prosecute them, or fund them as subcontractors of the CIA or the military or whatever. So I'm speaking as an American, incidentally. So insert your own group, if the KGB, or 1,000 years ago, whatever it would have been called, the Mossad, etc. So shepherds may wish to identify physiological contagions and then quarantine sheep to possibly eventually recover, for those sheep to recover physiologically, and then return to their economic functions as part of the flock. Now, the shepherds would want to do this not only for soldiers and for slaves and for bureaucrats, but also as a means of social control. It might not be all real, actual physiological contagions that they use within the Center for Disease Control. They may target things that actually aren't really threats, but they're useful to promote a certain cohesion within a social order. So maybe they say, hey, we're going to give everybody flu shots and flu vaccinations because there's a terrible threat. And maybe those vaccinations and shots are not really to prevent a contagion. Maybe there's some other purpose. But whatever purpose there is, if the shepherds identify it as a suitable purpose to promote, and they put money into it, train bureaucrats to do it, and get it done. So, with any actual contagions, it's important to keep the contagious folk, the contagious sheep, away from the healthy, from the healthy congregants, the healthy sheep, the healthy population, the healthy employees, the healthy children at the school. So you identify the ones that are potentially dangerous and you remove them, whether that's because of their criminal thoughts, their thought crimes, because of physiological illness, because they're disruptive to social order, because of things they say, the color of their skin, the languages they speak, their ethnic background. Shepherds at some point may say, we're going to segregate those people from the rest of the congregation. We're going to quarantine those people or separate the two groups for whatever purposes. So the contagious or potentially contagious are quarantined away. And maybe they die in quarantine, but at least they do not spread the contagion. So again, that's the kind of thing a shepherd would do. Now, with contagious ideas, if those ideas are perceived as a threat, the issue is pretty much the same. So even if some of the sheep merely develop ill will, that could be an issue. Ill will against whom? That ill will must be kept within certain bounds or can be disruptive to the social order. In some cases, ill will is useful to the social order. If there's ill will towards the other flock of sheep or towards the wolves, that could be useful for the purposes of the shepherd, that the sheep have that perception. Certain forms of ill will can be categorized as mental illness. So others would be a spiritual issue. That's resentment, that's insanity. That's obsession, that's preoccupation. So again, an employer, a religious organization, a shepherd, any of these groups may have a shepherd who would categorize certain kinds of language, certain kinds of behavior as unfit for the flock. It's not in the interests of the flock. So when we talk about national security or national interests, it's similar to talking about what's good for the flock, what's good for the group, what's good for our state, what's good for our bureaucracy. When we talk about the state, often what we really mean is the bureaucracy. So if I say the state of Florida, a lot of times what I mean is the network of the bureaucrats that operate doing business as the state of Florida. Certain forms of ill will be categorized as mental illness and medicated. And then those people can be put back into society or quarantined and separated and segregated from the rest of society, like in prisons or in mental hospitals. Or they can be drafted into the military or put into certain fields of industry. Well, those people should be minors. They're not fit for being airplane pilots. They don't have that security clearance, but we can use them as infantry or we can use them as minors. But we're not going to use them in various other restricted and exclusive and highly valuable positions. So, the shepherd recognizes the natural tendency to explore and encourages and guides it, yet also focusing that tendency to explore so as to avoid the exploring of any subjects that may be deemed functionally best to avoid, at least at a particular time and place for certain people. At a certain level of a student's progress, they wouldn't want to give calculus to the kindergartner probably. They'd want to give them stuff that's appropriate to them, not disturbing to them, not a threat to the social order. The shepherd recognizes the natural tendency to sort or prioritize, as in to judge or evaluate or assess or criticize in critical thinking. So, that naturally goes along with exploring. You explore a bunch of stuff and then critical thinking just naturally arises. So again, the shepherds train those who are ripe for that developmental stage to judge or evaluate and perform that judging or evaluation process in particular ways. How do the prosecutors in a court system operate? Well, they're given standards. They're trained and then given standards. And if they don't perform according to those standards, they are removed. They are no longer allowed to function as prosecutors. So if it suits the purposes of a shepherd might even cultivate dissent and controversy within a social order between a set of subcultures. Shepherds may cultivate dissent within a neighboring flock to weaken that other flock. Why? Well, maybe there's food or grass or whatever that's scarce, and if the other flocks are not handling wolves very well and are internal dissent and internal conflict and not good leadership amongst their shepherds is present, then that means that a shepherd that's competing against them may have access to the oil or to the food or to the diamonds or whatever resources might be somewhat scarce. And scarce basically means valuable. There's nothing, it's not like you have to have an actual real limit to the amount of fresh water in a particular area or across the whole planet. But if fresh water is valuable, then a shepherd is going to get that fresh water and monopolize access to it because that's what is in the best interest of that shepherd's flock. And if that means that other shepherds don't get it, or other flocks don't get it, or other shepherds have to come to that shepherd and trade or war to get access to that water or to that food or to that technology or to that fuel, well, that's valuable for the shepherds to control access to resources that make a difference for their flock and for their well-being. So the scarcity doesn't have to be natural. The shepherds can cultivate scarcity. What's it mean? It means if you've got 150 trees, you want to protect them, you want to log them and have exclusive access to that timber. Why? Well, so you know you can build houses when you need to. You know you can build bridges when you need to. Even if you don't need to now, you want the bridges, you want the wood available for bridges that you may need to build in the future. You don't want other shepherds taking that wood and building other bridges. You want to be in control of the resources, in control of the infrastructure like bridges, and also protecting the forests and keeping the forests healthy, or whatever other things are important to you, whether that's production of steel, production of automobiles, production of missiles, refining and extraction of fuel, whatever it may be. Recognizing the natural tendencies of judges to then become saints and attempt to alter the world so that there is only good and no evil, the shepherd will also govern over sainthood and how it manifests. If conflicts between saints fit the social order, then the shepherd will promote or at least allow conflicts between the saints and let them have all their different missions and let them have all their different campaigns to save the world from whatever problem. We can specify certain problems for them to address and fund them in their campaigns to advocate a certain thing or to prevent and fight against a certain thing. A shepherd is like a barber who trims hair in a certain way, or a gardener who prunes a tree in a certain way. They partner with the natural tendencies as they trim or prune or govern, and they promote the interests of the flock using words and any other methods that suit their purpose. While being a shepherd may be universally condemned as evil by shepherds, the fact is that there is such shepherding in the world. All the things I'm describing are actual patterns in reality. They exist in the world. We could explore them. We could condemn them. We could attempt to save the world from them. But they've been around thousands of years. They're probably going to be around. They're around now. They're probably going to continue to be around. And shepherds are the ones who might be most emphatic in condemning propaganda, or not. Maybe they don't personally condemn propaganda, or at least only in public, maybe not in private. Maybe in private they just study propaganda and implement propaganda and then condemn it as relevant to their purposes. So one can explore the archetype of the shepherd. One can avoid the archetype of the shepherd. One can promote it. One can condemn it. One can attempt to change it, or one can accept it and develop in that archetype. One can participate in it in any particular way or not. Shepherds are deliberate. They're clear. They're perceptive. They utilize a flock for their benefit. They form flocks. They make flocks coherent and cohesive and keep them that way. And they fleece flocks regularly. They receive benefit from their flocks. They receive support, like an employee supports an employer or the owner of a company. All the employees support the owner. Who makes the profit? The employer, the owner. All the employees support the owner. All the soldiers support the general and the general's accomplishment of a task. The general may not get in harm's way very often, but the general benefits. They have regular benefits from the sheep, just as a shepherd would. It's usually not in the interest of the shepherd to kill a lot of his own sheep, right? Unless he has a whole lot of sheep and some of the sheep start to get a little bit disloyal, then the shepherd might promote disloyalty to see which sheep really get into that disloyalty, and then the shepherd will actually target those sheep to be the soldiers or to be the targets of internal purges, anti-communist purges or anti-terrorist purges or anti-Jewish purges or whatever it may be. So purges are set up to cleanse the population of perceived or actual threats. Being a shepherd is quite a distinct thing from trying to save the world. Frankly, the first stage, when you don't have this compulsion to save the world, it's a relief. But as time goes on, there is the archetype of the shepherd, and advancing in it, participating in it, or not. One can just study it and teach about it, but that might not work so well, and at some point one may want to develop it and implement it. And that would mean gathering a congregation, identifying some interests and some risks, and promoting the interests of that congregation, that group, that movement. And that is the distinction shepherd. As I mentioned before, the One-Eyed King's Wealth Club, I said it wrong, there's no S, it's not plural. The One-Eyed King Wealth Club.com is a website in which I make reference to noticing early economic trends and then positioning to benefit from it. And that is something that I have particular expertise and competence in. And now that I've kind of sorted through my own issues of avoiding prosperity, sabotaging prosperity, shaming others, criticizing others, arguing with them, instead of simply promoting and advocating a particular opportunity, well, here we are. I've distinguished the shepherd for you. If you're interested in participating in the One-Eyed King's Wealth Club, you're welcome to take a look at that website and to contact me.